Terminology in the 1800s is so much fun because sometimes they called things exactly what they were and avoided political correctness of today, or they had quaint names which don't mean anything to us today. Once I described this room, you would say it's a bathroom or a toilet, but in the Army it was called the earth closet. Once you get to the seating mechanism and see the two holes, it's pretty clear what took place here. But there was no flush plumbing, as we would call it, back in the 1870s or early 1880s. So this was basically a larger version of a kitty litter box for humans. You would sit and do your duty, and then spread a little sand or charcoal over it to mask the odor. And then once a day, several unlucky soldiers who had probably hacked off their sergeant would get the wagon, bring it around, and all the contents were emptied into the wagon. They took it out someplace and just dumped it. And it's fairly efficient for the time, not as good as a sanitary sewer system, but it was the best they had. And it makes one wonder just how ripe it would have been, say, in the dog days of August. Hospitals in the 1800s were built on what were called the ward system, and to a viewer over the age of 60 maybe, they would recognize the concept. Rather than a private or a semi-private room, you put all the sick people together in one large room so that efficiently the steward or the assistant doctor could take care of them. Made perfect sense, except if you had people who had contagious issues, you basically were creating a huge germ factory, which leads us to the time period and their attitude and their knowledge about germs and sanitation. Primitive by our standards, they did the best they could in their own time. This particular ward has 8 beds in it. Actually, I'm sorry, more than that. It has 12, I think, at peak. The netting on the beds is rather interesting. While it served to keep the dust off of the patients, it also kept the flies off. Again, they weren't exactly sure of the connection between such things as malaria and mosquitoes, but they did know that keeping flies off of patients and off of open wounds created better comfort and certainly didn't create the issues that could occur when flies get into open sores. All of the equipment that you see is typical for a hospital of that time period. Lots of medicines and equipment as laid out. Any Army doctor in those days was really a triple threat. He was not only a general practitioner of medicine, he also had to be a surgeon, thus the term post-surgeon, and he had to have at least the equivalent of a minor degree in pharmacy, because that was all there was. If you were an Army doctor, you were it. And out here on the Western frontier, your average Army doctor was the only professional medical practitioner for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so he usually saw a steady stream of not only soldiers with various ailments, but also folks from the civilian community too. And it was always exciting to do something positive like deliver a baby, which happened on this post more than a few times in the 1870s and 1880s. One of the sites that we have at the fort is not a building at all, it's actually a ruin. This is what's left of officers' quarters number 5. It was, as all the other officers' quarters were, a housing for company officers built in the 1870s. It had a fire in the early 1900s and lost its second story. It was civilian housing for many years, and then by the 1970s it had pretty much fallen into ruin, and there are pictures of it in the mid to late 1970s with bushes and trees growing out of it, and it was a bloody mess. Then Director John Vaughn, among the immediate steps he took to brighten the site up, was to strip it down to its bare essentials and weed it out, and that's what you see here. It's a very effective exhibit that shows the construction of an officer's quarters and the thickness of the walls. There are no immediate plans to rebuild it, since there are many other missing buildings and repair jobs that we have ahead of us. We prefer to keep this as a exhibit that does show that structural issue and gives visitors a little bit of a feel for what may have been left here if the entire fort was not preserved. We're now focusing on Barracks 1 and 2, which are the 2 original barracks at Fort Concho, and viewers will notice the greenery that's up, again in preparation for our Christmas at Fort Concho event, first weekend of December. These two barracks were cavalry barracks. They were built larger than the other four barracks, two of which we still have. His cavalry units were larger units. They had between 70 and 90 men, thus they were subdivided into two squad rooms and thus had to handle more men. They are original. The stonework is original. Some of the original trusses are still inside. And as we will see at another point, Barracks number 1, up where our passenger car is parked, is our visitor center where guests to the fort begin their tour, can visit the gift shop, and see some of our ongoing and changing exhibits. We're now in the fort's visitor center at Barracks number 1, which serves as our welcoming area for our guests and also sort of the administrative nerve center for the fort, where we have our offices and sell tickets and take reservations and so forth for building rentals. And we try to have in this particular room a rotating series of exhibits, and we have several up right now. The colorful paintings that are on the wall are our version of sort of WPA art. Now, Works Progress Administration was the federal stimulus program of its day in the 1930s, and part of it was to find work for artisans, artists, photographers, sculptors, and the like. And it created a wide body of artistic work that remains a classic even today. These paintings are of that style, but we cannot document that they were done as part of the WPA era, so we call them sort of WPA era paintings, but they're not exactly of that program. In fact, unfortunately, due to a total lack of documentation, because these were given to us over 65 years ago, we really don't know who did them and why we got them, but we're happy to have them. And viewers will notice some scenes that are very familiar generically and specifically to San Angelo. There's a chuck wagon scene, a cattle scene, sheep scene, wool going to market scene, a cotton picking scene, a scene of the fort, a scene of downtown, a scene of San Angelo in the old days, and a scene of a flood. And of course, there were several major floods in this territory, including the great 1882 flood and the one of 1936. These will be on display until probably the end of January 2010. The second display that we have in our conference room at the Visitor Center is called Wish You Were Here. And it's a picture postcard history of San Angelo dating from the 1880s up until about 30 years ago. San Angelo was and is a major city in its heyday from the 1920s when the oil boom hit until the 1950s when the drought and the being bypassed by the interstate kind of hurt the town. San Angelo was the capital of West Texas. Its architecture, its public buildings, its private homes, its businesses, all were very solid, very stately, very majestic. Wonderful examples of local architecture. So staff created this exhibit specifically dividing the history of the town up into things and topics like schools, homes, churches, businesses, recreation, and of course Fort Concho. The postcards were an art form in their day. They are extremely accurate, usually very colorful, in some cases hand-painted and mass-produced, and in some cases they are the best, if not the only, illustration that we have of what some buildings look like. The sad part about this, much of this is gone. Time moves on, architecture changes, cities grow and develop, and buildings die. And that's sad. We're grateful for that which we have preserved, but visitors and guests here can look through and probably recognize some of these buildings if they're lifelong San Angeloans and have lived here more than 50 years. They would have to be in their 80s or even 90s perhaps to recognize some of these buildings when they were first erected.